On December 2nd, 2025, a silence fell over the auction room at Christie's in London. It wasn't just the usual quiet of a sale, the air was thick with tension. When the hammer finally fell, the room exhaled. The price? A staggering £22,895,000. That is roughly $30.2 million. It was a new world record for a Fabergé object, but for me, and I suspect for many of you who love the hidden layers of history, the real sensation wasn't the money, it was the buyer. The winning bid didn't come from an anonymous private collector or a new museum. The paddle was raised by Wartski, the legendary London antique dealers. And this is where the story turns from a business transaction into something deeply emotional. Before we begin, please support my channel by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you. Shortly after the sale, Wartski posted a photo of the egg with a caption that gave me chills. Returning to the Wartski nest after over 100 years. You see, this was a homecoming. Almost a century ago, it was Emanuel Snowman, an ancestor of the firm's current directors, who rescued this very egg from Soviet Russia. He carried it out in a simple suitcase to save it from being dismantled or lost forever. In 1934, they sold it to a collector for just £1,500. To see them pay over $30 million to bring it back to the nest today, it feels like the closing of a great historical circle. It's poetic justice, but it also begs a question. Why this egg? What is it about this specific object that drives experts to spend a fortune to reclaim it? To understand that, we need to look closer. At first glance, the winter egg looks like a ball of melting ice, fragile and fleeting. It isn't glass. It is carved from rock crystal. I have always been in awe of the sheer audacity of this choice. Rock crystal is incredibly unforgiving. It is hard, yet brittle. To achieve that transparency, the walls of the egg had to be ground down until they were as thin as paper. Just imagine the tension in the workshop. One slip of the tool, one moment of uneven pressure, and the entire piece would shatter into useless dust. It wasn't just craftsmanship, it was a gamble. To create the illusion of a frosty morning, the interior is engraved with fine lines, simulating ice crystals. But the genius is on the outside. The egg is embraced by a delicate platinum framework, set with over 3,000 diamonds. And here is a detail I absolutely love. These aren't the brilliant cut diamonds you see in modern rings, which are designed to burn with fire. These are rose-cut diamonds. They have fewer facets. They don't sparkle aggressively. They possess a soft, watery shimmer. They look exactly like frozen water droplets caught in the light. It sits on a base of rock crystal that looks like a melting block of ice, with rivulets of platinum trickling down the sides. It captures that precise, fleeting moment when winter begins to yield to spring. It is a masterpiece of cold beauty. But the story of how this icy design was born didn't start in an imperial palace. It started in a drafty workshop with a wealthy oil tycoon and a young woman staring at a frozen window. To find the origins of this frozen masterpiece, we have to leave the imperial court for a moment and step into the world of immense industrial wealth. The story actually begins with a man named Emanuel Nobel. If that surname sounds familiar, it should. He was the nephew of Alfred Nobel, the founder of the Nobel Prize. But Emanuel was a titan in his own right, one of the leading figures of the Russian oil industry, and, crucially for our story, one of Fabergé's most important and loyal clients. Nobel was a man who lived large, but he was also known for a very specific kind of hospitality. He famously threw extravagant dinner parties for foreign clients and business partners, and he had a charming, if slightly eccentric, tradition. He believed that a dinner wasn't truly a success unless every lady present left with a gift. However, he had a strict rule. These gifts were often tucked discreetly into the white linen napkins at the table settings. He wanted the discovery to be a surprise, but more importantly, he wanted to avoid any awkwardness. The gifts had to be beautiful and unique, but they couldn't use massive, ostentatious gemstones that might be misinterpreted as bribery. He wanted art, not just currency. In January 1911, or perhaps early 1912, accounts vary slightly on the exact date, Nobel approached Fabergé with an urgent and challenging commission. He was hosting one of these lavish dinners and needed 40 small pieces of jewelry for the ladies. They had to be ready quickly, they had to be made of high-quality materials, but above all, the design had to be completely new. He wanted something no one had ever seen before to commemorate the Russian winter. This high-pressure task didn't go to the firm's famous, established workmasters. Instead, it landed on the desk of a 23-year-old woman named Alma Peel. Alma was a self-taught designer, working in the workshop of her uncle, the head jeweler Albert Holmstrom. She had started out simply sketching finished items for the archive books, but her uncle had noticed her natural flair for design and begun giving her small projects. Now, she was staring down a deadline for one of the company's wealthiest clients. As the story goes, Alma was sitting at her workbench on a bitterly cold St. Petersburg day. The workshop was drafty, and the humidity had frozen onto the window panes. As she struggled for an idea, she looked up and saw the sunlight hitting the frost on the glass. It looked like an enchanted garden of ice crystals, sparkling with 1,000 tiny lights. That was her eureka moment. She realized she didn't need colored gems or heavy gold to capture the essence of luxury. She just needed to replicate the fragile beauty right in front of her. She immediately set to work, sketching designs that mimicked those ice fractals. She proposed using platinum silver, a metal that would disappear against the stones, and combined it with rock crystal and tiny rose-cut diamonds. The result was a series of frost flower brooches that looked like captured snowflakes. They were cool, elegant, and entirely different from the Rococo and neoclassical styles Fabergé was famous for. When Emmanuel Nobel saw the finished brooches, he was absolutely entranced. In fact, he was so taken with the concept that he did something quite rare. He bought the exclusive rights to the frost design. He essentially secured a monopoly, ensuring that only he could gift these winter treasures. He commissioned bracelets, pendants, and even a Nobel ice egg made of platinum and enamel. However, there was one person in Russia who outranked an oil baron. When Fabergé realized the potential of this design for the upcoming Romanov tercentenary, they had to ask Nobel for a favor. Would he allow them to break his monopoly just once, to create a supreme version of this winter theme for the emperor himself? Nobel agreed, and the path was cleared for the creation of the winter egg. With the exclusive rights to the winter design graciously waived by Nobel, Fabergé turned his attention to the most significant event of the calendar, the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. The year 1913 was a spectacle of pageantry. Across the Russian Empire, there were balls, parades, and religious services celebrating 3 centuries of a power that seemed absolute and unshakable. For this monumental occasion, Emperor Nicholas II commissioned 2 eggs, and the contrast between them tells us so much about his relationships. For his wife, Empress Alexandra, he presented the Romanov tercentenary egg. It was a heavy, stately piece, laden with political symbolism and adorned with miniature portraits of 18 czars. It was a dynastic statement. But for his mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna, Nicholas chose something entirely different. He didn't want history books. He wanted pure beauty. He entrusted Alma Peel to take her concept of frost and ice and push it to its absolute limit. The result was an object devoid of heavy imperial eagles or political messages. It was simply a poem about nature. When the invoice arrived from the House of Fabergé, it raised eyebrows even in a court used to excess. The price was listed at a staggering 24,600 rubles. To give you a sense of what that actually meant in 1913, the average Russian factory worker earned about 22 rubles a month. This means the winter egg cost roughly 93 years of a worker's wages. It was the most expensive egg of that year, costing significantly more than the one given to the emperor's wife. It was a silent testament to the emperor's devotion to his mother, proving that when it came to her, no expense was spared. And the details justify the cost. If you look at the very top of the rock crystal shell, there is a moonstone cabochon. It seems like a simple drop of frozen water, but painted on the reverse side is the date 1913. It's a subtle, almost hidden marker of time. But the true genius lies beneath that frozen surface. When the rock crystal halves are opened, the coldness of winter instantly gives way to the warmth of spring. Hidden inside is a delicate, double-handled basket made of platinum. It is suspended within the crystal shell, and it is filled to the brim with a bouquet of wood anemones. The craftsmanship here is mind-boggling. The basket itself is set with over 1,300 tiny diamonds, but the flowers are the real miracle. Each one was carved from a single piece of white quartz, with stems and stamens made of gold wire and centers set with demantoid garnets. The leaves were meticulously shaped from nephrite, rising from a bed of spun gold moss. It is a botany lesson rendered in precious stone, capturing the fragility of a real flower with materials that will last forever. We don't have a written record of exactly what Maria Fyodorovna said when she opened it, but we know the gift was a triumph. How? Because the very next year, the young Alma Peel was asked to design the Easter egg for the Empress Alexandra herself, the famous mosaic egg. And honestly, that piece deserves a moment of our attention, because it confirms Alma's unique way of seeing the world. Just as she looked at a window and saw ice jewels, for the 1914 egg, she watched her mother-in-law doing needlework by the fire and saw high art. She decided to recreate the texture of petite point embroidery in metal and stone. She designed a grid of platinum to mimic the fabric mesh and filled it not with thread, but with tiny, calibrated sapphires, rubies, and emeralds. It is literally embroidery rendered in gemstones. It proved that her genius wasn't just about ice. She had this incredible ability to look at ordinary, domestic things and translate them into the most sophisticated art imaginable. Yet, there is a tragic beauty in this symbolism that always stays with me. The wood anemone is a flower of the early spring, a sign of life breaking through the snow, promising renewal and resurrection. For Maria Fyodorovna, receiving this in 1913, it must have seemed like a beautiful omen for the next century of the dynasty. She couldn't have known that this would be one of the last peaceful Easters the family would ever celebrate. It was a symbol of a spring that, for the Romanovs, would never truly come again. Within a year, the world would be at war, and the empire that seemed so permanent would begin its rapid descent into history. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked the beginning of the end, and by 1917, the monarchy had collapsed. For those few chaotic years, the winter egg remained in St. Petersburg, likely at the Anichkov Palace, the residence of the Dowager Empress. But as the situation in the capital became increasingly unstable, the provisional government made a desperate decision to move the imperial treasures to Moscow for safekeeping. They were evacuated and locked away in the Kremlin armory. When the Bolsheviks seized power, these items ceased to be sentimental gifts or works of art. They became assets. They were cataloged, numbered, and piled up in the storerooms of the Gokran, the state depository for valuables. There are surviving photographs from the 1920s that frankly send a shiver down my spine. They show tables groaning under the weight of diadems, necklaces, and Fabergé eggs, with Bolshevik officials standing behind them, looking not at beauty, but at potential currency. To the new regime, these were bourgeois excesses. The country needed tractors, machinery, and grain. The decision was cold and pragmatic. Sell the Romanov jewels to the West to fund the Soviet state. This brings us to one of the most terrifying periods in the history of art preservation. The agency known as Antiquariat was established to liquidate these treasures. Many pieces were broken apart. Diamonds pried out of their settings with pliers to be sold as loose stones. The gold melted down for bullion. It is a miracle that the winter egg, made of fragile rock crystal, survived this process at all. It lay there, likely in a dusty box or on a crowded shelf, a piece of ice waiting to be shattered or sold. Fortunately for history, it was sold. In 1927, a man arrived in Moscow who would change the fate of this egg forever. His name was Emanuel Snowman. He was the representative of the London jewelry firm Wartski. At a time when most Westerners were terrified to set foot in Soviet Russia, Snowman was making trips back and forth, negotiating directly with the Soviet government to purchase these discarded treasures. And here's a coincidence that feels almost scripted. The man who came to rescue the winter egg was named Mr. Snowman. It is one of those delightful historical ironies that you just can't make up. Snowman saw the egg and recognized what the Soviet appraisers had missed. He saw the genius of the platinum frost and the impossible thinness of the crystal. He negotiated a price that, looking back, seems absolutely absurd. He bought the winter egg for £450. If we adjust for inflation, that's roughly £36,000 today. Remember, Nicholas II paid 24,600 rubles for it, a fortune. The Soviets sold it for the price of a modest car. But purchasing the egg was only the first step. Emanuel Snowman still had to get it out of Russia and back to London. We have to remember that in the 1920s, the specialized art logistics and high-security shipping we rely on today simply did not exist. According to the history of the firm, Snowman brought his acquisitions back personally. This means the winter egg, with its incredibly thin rock crystal walls, likely traveled across Europe by train in his personal luggage. It is quite a remarkable set of circumstances. After surviving the revolution and the rough conditions of the confiscation depots, this fragile masterpiece made its escape not in an armored truck, but simply packed away among a traveler's belongings, relying entirely on Snowman's care to reach London in one piece. Emanuel Snowman successfully brought the egg to London, and for the first time, it entered the inventory of Wartski. It was safe, but it wouldn't stay in their nest for long. The world of collectors was beginning to wake up to Fabergé, and the winter egg was about to begin a long game of hide-and-seek that would last for the rest of the century. Once safe in London, the winter egg didn't remain in the Wartski nest for very long. In 1934, it began a journey through the hands of some of Britain's most prominent collectors. It was first sold to Lord Allington of Critchell House in Dorset. The price? A mere £1,500. It feels almost painful to hear that figure now, doesn't it? But we have to remember that in the 1930s, the world was a very different place, and the market for Russian curiosities had not yet reached the fever pitch we see today. From Lord Allington, the egg passed to Sir Bernard Eckstein, a man known for his keen eye. Then, in 1949, it was auctioned at Sotheby's and purchased by a gentleman named Brian Ledbrook. Ledbrook was a passionate collector, a man who truly understood the value of what he held. For 26 years, the winter egg remained in his care, safe and admired. But then, in 1975, Brian Ledbrook passed away, and with his death, the winter egg simply vanished. For nearly 2 decades, a heavy silence fell over the whereabouts of this masterpiece. In the catalogues of Fabergé scholars and art historians, a chilling note began to appear next to the entry for the winter egg: location unknown. You have to understand how terrifying that phrase is in the world of art. When a piece as fragile as this disappears, the imagination immediately goes to the worst-case scenarios. Had it been dropped? Had that paper-thin rock crystal finally shattered into 1,000 pieces? Had it been stolen, broken up for its diamonds, the platinum melted down for scrap? For 20 years, the art world held its collective breath, fearing that Alma Peel's greatest creation had ceased to exist. But the truth, as it often turns out, was far less dramatic, but perhaps even more surprising. The egg hadn't been stolen, and it hadn't been destroyed. It was playing a long game of sleeping beauty. In 1994, the egg was discovered in the most mundane place imaginable, a safe deposit vault in a London bank. It had been sitting there, quietly gathering dust in the dark, tucked away for safekeeping, and, for all intents and purposes, forgotten by the outside world. It was a time capsule, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. When the news broke that the winter egg had been found, the relief was palpable. But relief quickly turned to excitement. Christie's announced that the egg would be offered for sale in Geneva later that year. The auction in November 1994 was a watershed moment. The world had changed since Brian Ledbrook bought the egg in 1949. The appreciation for Fabergé had grown from a niche interest into a global obsession. When the bidding started, the room was electric. The price soared past the old estimates, past the old records. When the hammer finally came down, the winter egg sold for $5.5 million. Think about that trajectory. From 450 pounds in a suitcase in 1927 to 1,500 pounds in the 1930s to $5.5 million in 1994. It wasn't just inflation, it was a recognition of artistry. The world had finally caught up with the genius of Alma Peel. The ice had thawed, and the winter egg was once again the star of the show. It seems the winter egg is not the type of treasure that likes to stay still for too long. After re-emerging from the bank vault in 1994, it didn't disappear for another generation. Just 8 years later, in 2002, the egg was back in the spotlight, this time at Christie's in New York. The appetite for imperial treasures had only grown, and the bidding reflected that intensity. The hammer fell at $9.6 million, another world record broken by the very same object. The buyer was revealed to be the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, a man known for his voracious appetite for art and his role in building world-class collections. However, the years following the sale were marked by a strange kind of silence. While the egg was officially part of a magnificent private collection in Qatar, there were persistent whispers in the art world that suggested a more complicated reality. Some rumors circulated that perhaps the transaction hadn't been as straightforward as it appeared on paper. There was talk, never officially confirmed but stubbornly present, that the egg might have actually remained in London all those years, perhaps sitting in Christie's own storage due to unsettled financial matters. Whether it was in a palace in Doha or a secure facility in London, the result for us, the admirers, was the same. The egg was effectively hidden from view, a ghost that everyone knew existed but no one saw. And this brings us back to where we started, that electric night in London in December 2025. When the winter egg appeared for sale for the third time in 30 years, the stakes were higher than ever. As we know, the price soared to over $30 million. But when the name of the buyer was finally revealed, the immense sum of money suddenly seemed like the least interesting part of the story. Wartski. For those who don't follow the antique trade closely, Wartski is a small family firm of art dealers in London. But in the world of Fabergé, they are royalty. The purchase was a moment of profound historical symmetry. Remember Emanuel Snowman, the man who carried the egg out of Soviet Russia in his luggage in 1927? He was the ancestor of the current directors of Wartski. He bought it for £450 to save it from destruction or dispersal. He brought it to London. He gave it a second life. Now, 98 years later, the firm founded by his family has stepped in to buy it back. They didn't buy it to make a quick profit. You don't spend $30 million on a fragile object just to flip it. They bought it to bring it home. In their own words, posted alongside a photo of the egg just after the auction, they described it as returning to the Wartski nest after over 100 years. It is a touching reminder that in the world of cold stones and hard metals, there is still room for sentiment and a deep sense of custodianship. The egg has survived revolutions, confiscations, dark vaults, and global travels, only to find its way back to the very people who first recognized its value when the rest of the world saw only bourgeois excess. While the winter egg was traveling the world, commanding the attention of kings and emirs, the woman who breathed life into its frozen shell was living a very different reality. After the Russian Revolution shattered the world of the Romanovs, Alma Peel's brilliant career at the House of Fabergé came to an abrupt, silent halt. In 1921, after years of hardship, she and her husband managed to obtain permission to leave Petrograd. They fled to Finland, leaving the glittering capital behind for a quiet life in the industrial town of Kuusinkoski. There, the woman who had designed the most expensive gift for the Russian Empress took up a job as an art teacher at a secondary school. She spent 23 years in that classroom. Her students remember her fondly. They recall a petite lady with sharp, friendly eyes who wielded her pencil like a magic wand. She could add a single line or a dash to a child's drawing and miraculously transform it into something special. But here is the detail that breaks my heart a little. In all those years, she never told her students who she really was. She never mentioned that she was the first female designer for Fabergé. She never spoke of the diamond snowflakes or the rock crystal eggs. Her silence was born of necessity. In the early years after the Revolution, having connections to the imperial court was a dangerous thing, even across the border. Later, it perhaps just felt like a dream from another life, something too extravagant to explain in a modest Finnish town. She kept her secret until the end. Alma Peel passed away in 1976, never knowing that her name would one day be spoken with reverence by art historians around the world. It was only later, when her design albums were rediscovered, that the world finally connected the humble art teacher to the legendary winter designer. Today, we look at the winter egg and see a $30 million asset. We see a record breaker, but its true value lies in that fleeting moment in a drafty St. Petersburg workshop when a young woman looked at a frozen window and decided to capture that beauty forever. It is a profound thought to end on. The Romanov Empire, which seemed eternal, crumbled into dust. The vast fortunes of the nobility evaporated. Even the life of its creator faded into obscurity. But the fragile ice she carved from rock crystal survived it all. It outlasted the wars, the revolutions, and the decades of darkness. And now, finally, after a century of wandering, the winter has come home. With the winter egg back in the hands of Wartski, there is a palpable sense of excitement in the jewelry world, and a genuine glimmer of hope. For the last 20 years, while it resided in a private collection, this masterpiece was effectively invisible, a legend that no one could actually visit. But Wartski has a long tradition of scholarship and sharing their treasures. So, perhaps we can dare to dream that soon, this icy wonder won't just be a photograph in a book or a headline about millions of dollars. There is a very real chance it could finally be put on public display. And even if we cannot all travel to London to see it in person, simply knowing that it is out of the dark and accessible to art lovers again feels like a victory in itself. It deserves to be seen by the world, not hidden away in a silent vault. If you feel these stories deserve to be remembered, I invite you to stay with the channel. We have many more doors to open in the royal treasuries, where every gemstone holds a silent yet magnificent secret waiting to be told. Thank you so much for spending this time with me.